Welcome to Navigating Today's Economy. I'm Aliyah Jiwanthour. Today, we're taking a closer look at the current economic climate globally with an emphasis on what's happening here in Canada. Our goal is to help the Jamaat better navigate the current situation. To help us with this, we are joined by Riaz Ahmed. He is a chartered professional accountant and the president and CEO of TD Securities. Formerly, he was the chief financial officer at TD. Within the Jamaat, he has a long history of service as well. He's currently the chair of the National Committee of the Aga Khan Foundation Canada and a member of the board of the Aga Khan Museum. In the past, he has also served as the chair of the Aga Khan Economic Planning Board for Canada. Riaz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Aliyah.
Can you provide us with a high-level overview of the current state of the economy globally and specifically the impact it has on us here in Canada?
Aliyah, today we have a number of developments that are at play simultaneously. So first of all, we have a situation where emerging out of the pandemic, we're seeing that the pressure on demand for products and services has grown rapidly this year. So we've got a demand curve driving prices upwards. Then there are a number of geopolitical factors. So you see, for example, an energy crisis developing in Europe, which is causing energy and commodity prices to rise. And you've got a situation with the Asian supply chains where companies and governments are looking for more secure supply chains where they feel that they can trust those supply chains and not be held hostage to political factors that may well emerge. Thirdly, we've got a situation where we're in a very hot job market and wages are generally increasing as people can find better paying jobs more frequently, and almost every job that is, for every person that is today unemployed, there is a job available for them in the aggregate in the marketplace. So all of those factors are creating a situation which is feeding inflation upwards. And central banks are essentially saying this is not good for the economy generally to have runaway inflation, and through 2022 raised interest rates very rapidly in order to try to address this question and to start pulling back on inflationary forces. Now, Canada has done fairly well so far in this because we are a resource and a commodity-based economy, and so Canada is actually doing quite well in this circumstance. And the evidence of that is that we have multi-decade low unemployment in Canada today. And you can also see the robust flows into taxation flows into provincial and federal governments, which is telling you that there's a lot of income in the system that is creating all these funds. But the question is therefore going to be that the central bank's objective is to cool the economy, and when that happens, we will see unemployment rising, and we will see some stress materializing. The question is when and for how long would that be? Would we see a soft landing to what some are predicting we may well avoid a recession altogether and just might get to a zero growth? Or will we see a more harder landing and a more painful outcome? And that's the real question that we're faced with today.
It's interesting you talk about the recession, because if you're following the news, there are surveys, there are reports that says Canada is heading towards a recession in 2023. Would you agree?
I do think that is what the economic consensus is, but it is interesting that that analysis is changing fairly quickly. There are people who sort of predict that we are going to need a very hard landing in order to be able to pull back on inflation more effectively. And yet just earlier this week, we saw some research reports come out and predict a very mild economic recession to maybe not even getting into one. So the dynamics and those who are in the business of predicting are, there's some very significant different views out there. And I think the importance is to be ready for any particular scenario that might arise.
What are your tips on how do we ready ourselves for a potential recession?
Yeah, I think, look, from a individual perspective, we've long talked about in the Jamaat, in the community, that it's just so important to make sure that we have a series of savings and financial support that allow us to get to the other side of the valley, if I can say it this way. And coming out of the pandemic 2 years in 20 and 21, we really did get an opportunity to test what that would look like. And many received support from the governments in order to help cushion that, but one can always look at their own circumstances from just a modeling or a scenario analysis perspective and say, how would we have gotten through this period should that government support not have been present? There are a number of very different techniques that are out there in the press that one can read about, which can range from perhaps making choices that are different in terms of picking lower cost alternatives on consumption requirements, or in the case of people that may have debt, that they can choose to pay that debt back over a longer period of time, or allow for some short period of time for their payments to be less than the accruing interest, so that actually you're borrowing more in that instance, but it is a technique that is available in the short run, to very longer measures where sometimes people might choose to just live in cities or in towns that are cheaper, perhaps in different parts of Canada. And those can be, they're very realistic choices, and the spectrum of those choices on a case-by-case basis vary from being very viable to perhaps being very painful. But those are the choices that are out there. There is no magic bullet or no silver bullet in this. When painful times arrive, everybody has to make those decisions that are within their set of alternatives that they can choose from.
One of the biggest challenges facing many people right now is the rising interest rates. We have seen a number of rate hikes already. We are bracing for more. Mm-hmm. In your experience, how long is this going to last? Yeah.
Well, it may last a while yet, because we do know that the economy, as I mentioned a little earlier, is continuing to show remarkable resilience. It is still growing, albeit at a slower rate, and unemployment has still been very steady, and we've not seen signs of stress in the employment markets, generally speaking, and all of which would then cause the central banks to perhaps need to raise their rates even more in order to pull the economy, to have an effective lever on inflation. So while markets have been predicting what that terminal rate could be, where rate increases should then start leveling off and perhaps even coming down, that terminal rate forecast has been steadily increasing. At some point, people thought it might be 3%, then it went to 4%, now it's 5%. So, and there's no reason why it might not be 6 or 7 down the road, although everybody would sincerely hope that we would not find ourselves there. But the economy is robust, and as I mentioned earlier, Canada is doing relatively well in this period. So I think there is room for it to rise, and I think we ought to be prepared.
So we've seen a number of interest rate hikes over the past year. We are bracing for additional rate hikes. For those people looking to break into the residential real estate market and buy a home for the first time, it's got to be quite discouraging to see the rates continue to rise. What is your advice to them?
Yeah. No, I imagine, Aliyah, that to be true, because the impact of the increased interest rates is far outweighing the reduction in house prices that we've seen. So you're quite right in pointing out that affordability is actually becoming more problematic with these rate rises. Now, I think all these kinds of questions, Aliyah, should be framed in the question of affordability. And when one looks at their budgeting and compares it against their desires for what kind of home ownership they might like to attain, where is that balance one has to look at? I think in the affordability question, people, Aliyah, may have to find themselves making choices about the size of home that they might wish to buy, the location of where that home might be, and how they choose to finance it, what kind of assistance they may get from friends and family around that. And it may be that we're already seeing this play out a little bit in the key markets in Vancouver and Toronto, particularly where you may see older homes located on larger lots, and the various municipalities are now allowing those lots to be redeveloped into multiple housing, where you might have 2 or 3 homes where there was previously 1. And so each of those homes may be a bit smaller than what was there before, and it may not be the first choice that a young couple might have about where they might like to land, but it may be that during this period of higher rates that a particular choice has to be made that meets the needs, but maybe not all the needs. And down the road, there may be opportunities to upgrade and to make changes to suit the family's circumstances a bit more cleanly. So I think these are, when we see interest rates increase so rapidly, we have to be adaptable in this sense. And we as a community, as a Jamaat, in our history, have really always had this issue where we lived in extended families. We also now are experimenting with the Imam's guidance on multi-generational housing, where we have shared accommodation so generations can help each other. And so we may well need to revert to those types of models for some period of time. And the Western concept of everybody having their own individual large homes in large suburbs may not well be the place where we see ourselves for the next little while. But what is the good news for us is that culturally we're adapted to this. We know how it works. It can require certain levels of compromise and adaptability, but I think it's important when we're faced with these situations to be open to that and to be able to talk about it openly in order to find solutions that work for families.
Staying on the topic of interest rates, those people who already have a mortgage, let's say their mortgage is up for renewal within the next 0 to 6 months. The question is always fixed or variable. Yeah. But when you have such high interest rates, what is your advice on what to do?
Yeah, look, I think the combination of the fact that home prices were elevated and therefore large mortgages came out at very cheap prices has really magnified the math around this, Aliyah, to your point. Just to give you a simple example, if you had a family that had $1 million mortgage that might have been a 2% interest rate, the interest component of that mortgage would simply, in simple terms, be $20,000. And if you're renewing at 5%, that's $50,000 now, so that's like a 150% increase. So that's going from order of magnitude $1,600 a month payment to a little bit over $4,000 a month payment. And so it's quite a leveraged increase in payments. Now, whether people choose to refinance on a fixed or a variable basis, I think is subject to the same issues that they would have faced when they first got into the mortgage, which is to have an assessment of their ability to tolerate the risk of rates rising further and then perhaps falling. If it turns out that we do come into a recession and central banks start cutting rates again, then by staying variable, you might take that early risk of rates rising but benefit from rates falling down the road. Or if you go into a fixed rate, maybe you might pick 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever your comfort level is. And I think that decision entirely falls within that framework of affordability that I talked about earlier, which is, can people tolerate that risk? None of these choices are silver bullets, and none of these choices are kind of risk-free in the sense that you're always making some trade-off, and the question is to make a trade-off that you would not regret, and that would not leave you feeling, oh, if I look back to the choice I made 2 years ago, down the road, you don't want to sort of find yourself in a position of feeling regretful about that. So I think a very rational kind of a framework of saying what gives us peace of mind and how do we sleep at night is the most important factor in my mind in how people should think about this.
You know, a standard lesson that we've all learned is what goes up must come down, eventually at least. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you foresee in the short term and long term for interest rates?
Yeah, look, today, while most of the Western central banks, let's say in the US and in Canada particularly, are beginning to talk about slowing down the rate of increase. But it is still an increase. It's just a slower rate of increase. And at the same time, if you look at financial markets, the yield curve on bonds, et cetera, you do see that the markets are thinking that sometime in 23 or 24, early 24, we may see an inflection point where rates will start coming down because in that sometimes you'll read in the press about inverted yield curves, which means short rates are higher than long rates. And when short rates are higher than long-term rates, what it says is that people are thinking in the longer-term rates will start coming down again. The question that an individual has to address is, do you trust that? Is it a perfect indicator? And no, it's not a perfect indicator because it changes every day based on what's happening in the economy, what's happening on geopolitical factors. A number of those factors that I talked about earlier are changing every day, which means people's expectations around rates are changing every day. So you can take a view based on what the markets are indicating to you, or you might have a favorite financial advisor that might tell you what their perspective is. And in all of those cases, I think it kind of goes back to what can you tolerate in your personal finances. And so I do think that at some point when the economy cools, rates will start coming off. What I can tell you is when that'll happen and how much. But I don't think it'll go back to where it was before the pandemic. Which was where rates were nearly zero and interest rate curves are very flat for a very long period of time. That was kind of the golden age of cheap money, and I think it's gone for some time.
Do you think that's the reason we're in this situation now? Is that we went through this golden time of money?
Look, I think for those people who have been around long enough, you know that even interest rates today at 4 or 5%, there are people around who would say that's still cheap because people borrowed at 10, 11, 12, 18, 19, 20, 21%. So does a 4, 5, 6% rate contextually feel very high as a cost of money? No, it doesn't. To me, it doesn't. But there is a whole generation that has not seen these rates, so that what we have seen in the last 10 years with very low rates has set our expectations of what the financial realities in the marketplace are. But if you take a longer horizon, you would say it's not that expensive even now.
So for those of us who have not lived through that, as people look to approach budgeting and planning for the future, how do you approach that when the cost of everything right now keeps going up?
Yeah, I think this is the trick of inflation, that it just constantly goes up and it actually feeds on itself, because people might look at today and say, supposing if I need a cell phone today, and if I might say, well, I need a cell phone 6 months from now, but it's going to be more expensive, so I should buy it now. And you're fueling that demand today, which is fueling inflation. So it kind of feeds on itself a little bit, and it can be very tricky in that way. But look, I think that the choices that people have to make fall into the categories of sort of saying, okay, focus on what you need versus what you want. So that's the first instance, to just work your way through. The second thing is to just consider, as we talked a little earlier, about lifestyle expectations, about what is really important to you, and what are the things that you're willing to compromise in this environment, and to simplify and remove excess materiality from your life. And then there's the matter of looking for cheaper alternatives, which, for example, we talked about living in smaller centers for some period of time, and distinguishing between good debt and bad debt. And bad debt should be paid off quickly, and good debt should be structured to be more affordable. But those, Aliyah, are the technical components of budgeting and planning. I think equally important are the emotional and psychological aspects of it, which are generally less well understood and not as frequently talked about. And this is the part where at the individual level, at a family level, at a community, Jamaati level, in your workplace, there is this psychological impact of how, let's, for lack of better words, say the keep up with the Joneses factor. And there can also be issues about belonging to a community. So those pieces do essentially create a lot of non-rational stress. And I think what is important for us as a Jamaat and a community is to try to figure out how do we address those points so that we don't find ourselves accidentally putting undue pressure on people. That they should look a particular way, that they should behave in a particular way, that they should have a car that looks like this, or that they have a home that looks like that, or that their dressing on a particular day should be up to the nines, or, we do have these elements that are less technical and rational, but that play largely in how people kind of think about themselves. And I think those issues create family angst, they create emotional stress, they create mental health issues. And the question is, how do we destigmatize those issues? And when you go through these periods of stress in the economy, you can find ourselves there. Now, earlier I said that Canada is still faring well. So to me, the most important thing as a Jamaat is for us to think about how can we be ready should a deeper stress come, that we're stronger, more united, that every individual has thought through that should we head into a deep stress, how will I be able to support the Jamaat? But more importantly, if you are the one that needs support, how do you go ask for it? And how do you seek that support? Because that is the hardest thing to do. And that's the issue that I think I worry the most about.
Another concern during economically challenging periods is that people may lose their jobs, adding further to the stress. Do you have any tips on how people can stay relevant or competitive in this job market?
Yeah. Look, I think, Leah, to me, this is a continuous issue that people ought to be thinking about all the time and at all levels. It is equally applicable to me. Because I think as we think about how we develop our careers, to me, there are sort of three most significant issues. Number one is always to remain flexible. Like what you're doing today may not be what you can do tomorrow. And during periods of stress, are you able to adjust to say, this is not exactly what I'd love to be doing, but I'll do it because I have to for some short period of time. So flexibility is important, flexibility of mind. And even in good times, we hear young people just graduating sometimes come out and say, I can't find a job that I find particularly engaging or exciting, and I end up working in this sort of a role, which is a kind of a not that exciting role, and it's not that engaging. And so we know that these situations exist, and the question is, how do we set ourselves to cope with it for some period of time to get our legs under us, so to speak. So flexibility. The second issue in my mind, which is frequently talked about, is networking. Now, networking is often thought of, I go introduce myself to you and then say, Aliyah, hi, I'm Riaz, here's my card, please call me sometime, and it'd be lovely to have a coffee and whatnot. And yes, there is that bit of about networking that is important. But I think the networking that really matters is that about your brand. What are you known for? And in all the times that you've worked with people throughout your career, whether you went to school with them, whether you were in your earlier career with them, whether you are working with them on voluntary things in the Jamaat, that you want everybody around you to think that when they need something, that's the person I want. If I have an issue in my business or in my place of employment, I want to know, the first thing I want to remember is Aliyah. I've worked with her before. She's super. She works hard. She's a quick learner. And so how can you create that brand for yourself where you are the first person that people think about? Now, many times people say, well, it's a kind of an unfair market because it depends on who you know. And I say, yeah, actually, there is a part of it that depends on who you know. And the reason that is because managers are under so much pressure to succeed nowadays that when they have a big project or an issue that they need to deal with, are they going to go with a resume that looks really good, but they don't know who's behind that resume? Or are they going to go with somebody they know? And I think 90% of the time, people would go with somebody they know. So it matters. Your network and your brand and what you're known for really matters. And you have to cultivate that every day in good times and in not so good times. So networking. And then the last thing I would say is what Hazimam has always told us about continuous learning. Like, are you learning something new every day, every month, every year? One of the things I like to say to people is as you get to the end of the year and you start thinking about your holidays, your resolutions and whatnot, it's always important to say, what did I learn this year? And how do I package what I learned this year? And if you're finding that you cannot really say that you learned anything new on in your job that particular year, or you didn't get to know anybody, or then you're probably starting to realize that you're stagnating. And that's an opportunity to do a little bit of rebooting, a little bit of resetting, and saying, maybe I need to take an extra course. Oh, I don't have time to take an extra course, but maybe you do have to take an extra course, because we're always trying to balance things. But that piece of continuous learning on the job is super important, and it doesn't matter when. You know, one of the things I've liked to tell folks at TD is who ask me about this question of work from home or return to office, is I'd say, you know, if I were an lead CEO of the investment bank and I went and told our people that in Houston and in Tokyo and Singapore, where our offices are, that I'm never coming to see you, I'm only going to see you by WebEx, and I told you that I'm never going to come see your clients, your CFOs and CEOs, I'm only going to deal with them by phone or by Zoom or by WebEx, you might say to me, I don't think you're going to work out. And that applies to everyone. It's not just young people establishing their career. But if you're someone like me who've changed a job from being the CFO of the bank to being to leading the wholesale bank, you need to get out, right? And so I think that that getting out is continuous learning. You know, you're establishing relationships with your clients. You're wanting to know what their issues are. How might they come and need your services at what time, et cetera. And it's just continuous learning that you have to get at every day. And so I think that when you go through that flexibility, continuous learning, networking, I think you're maximizing your chances that should you lose your job, that you're able to regroup fairly quickly.
For business owners in the Jamaat, the pandemic was really hard on many businesses. Some shut down permanently, some were just barely treading water, and now they're faced with a really tough economic climate. Any suggestions on what they can do to not just survive, but perhaps thrive at this time?
Aliyah, it's interesting that you mentioned the pandemic, because when businesses go through a stress, the first thing that it informs the owners and managers of business is your product resilient? And is your distribution resilient? Your selling process, your marketing, your brand, et cetera. And I would say that given that we've just been through the pandemic, at least people, members of the Jamaat who are business owners, will have a good view of their businesses from that lens to say, is it a resilient business? Now, every stress is different, but at least there is one of two data points that say, how did I do during the pandemic, and how do I think I might do if rates went up or we hit a recession, et cetera. And again, if government support was not available, what would people do? So number one, it is an opportunity to test your business model. And then the second thing is that it allows you the opportunity to improve your business and your operations, because you might say there are certain parts of the businesses that are loss-making that you've really not wanted to handle or deal with. And this is your opportunity to deal with it, to make it more capital efficient, to make it more operational efficient, remove the redundant expenses that you come to realize that, hey, this particular marketing channel is not really that attractive, but I've been doing it just because the person is my friend and I want to support them. And yes, but you do have an opportunity to really strengthen the capital and operational efficiency of the business. The third thing is that if you have the resources, you might actually choose to either diversify, if you believe in the strength of your business model, and widen it or scale it, or you might take the opportunity to buy adjacent businesses in order to deepen your own supply chain capability in that environment that you're operating in. So I think that downturns can be both an opportunity and a problem, and it may be, as you mentioned in the pandemic, that certain businesses will come to realize that they don't have a business model that is resilient, in which case the question is, how do you exit at the least cost? How do you manage your people? How do you manage your leases, your fixed commitments, so that should you have to close down in the unfortunate circumstances, that you're lessening the cost to you. If you've given guarantees on your debt, how do you manage your way through that in order to minimize the losses, etc.? So in all these cases, I would hope that because we went through this large stress, that businesses and Jamaat is better prepared. But as I said, all scenarios are not the same, and so it's always good to just look at these questions all the time, continuously.
In his message to the Jamaat on Imamat Day, Hazri Imam talked about exercising prudence at this time. Do you have any tips or suggestions on how we can all be more prudent at this time?
Well, I think if you look up prudence, it means acting with care and thoughtfulness towards the future. And that can vary by an individual circumstances. Like if you took a very simple example and said, you come across a person who says, I upgrade my iPhone every 2 years because I want the latest, greatest every 2 years. And so every time you upgrade, it's $1,500 a pop. And in 10 years, you've upgraded 5 times and you've spent $7,500. And then somebody else might come along and say, well, I think I can stretch mine to 3 years or a bit more than that. And I don't need the latest model. I can be one model behind, and that's $1,000. And in 10 years, they will have spent $3,000, which is 60% less than the first person. So who's more prudent? And the answer depends. If the first person absolutely relies on their phone for their living, because that's how they earn their income, for example, and they need all the latest gadgets to be most productive, and that's what you might very well say that they're the ones who are being more prudent because it's maximizing their revenue. And to the person who just basically uses it for email and telephone, the second option is more prudent. So I think the more important thing is to just say every decision that you make, major decision financially or otherwise, has to have a lens of care, and to me that means not being frivolous with things. So again, if like me, you use a car to just go to the GO train every day, which is like you're putting 6 kilometers on the car. I have a 13-year-old car. What does it matter? My colleagues at work sometimes laugh and say, why are you driving a 13-year-old car? But that's because I don't need another car. So it is to me, that's my prudence. Whereas if a salesperson is on the road all the time and putting on 60, 70,000 kilometers, selling and they probably do need a leased car that they're turning in every 2 years. So I think it's very circumstantial, but the important thing is to just kind of keep in mind, are you being rational with your decisions? And that's how I would say we just need to deepen that practice, is I think what Hazimam's asking us to do.
Riaz, this has been incredibly informative. You've not only helped us increase our understanding, but also helped us to navigate not only the current situation, but what's to come. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Leah. It's nice to be here. Thank you.